Hey y'all, I'm going to read chapter 11, Uncle Will in Heaven. The two families had camped right at the fork in the road, which would soon lead them in different directions. The Morgans would be heading towards their home in Chesterville, Texas, and Pansy's family would push on towards Galveston, which was now only a few more days away. Even though they had only been together a few short days, the two families felt like they were losing longtime friends as the wagons drifted apart. Pansy watched out for the back of their wagon, while Ginny watched out the back of her wagon. Both girls kept waving goodbye until the curve in the road no longer allowed them to see each other. Pansy sat on the big pillows with a single tear hanging on to her cheek. She wiped her nose, her eyes, with one sweep of her hand and looked up at Mama. "I think Papa wants to see you up front," said Mama. Most of the time, Papa was the only one sitting on the wagon bench and leading the horses. Occasionally, Mama would relieve him when he grew tired of sitting and wanted to walk for a while. Sometimes, both Papa and Mama would sit and talk while the wagon rolled along. Pansy couldn't remember ever being asked to come up and sit with Papa as he drove, so she wondered what this was about. "You better get up on front," urged Mama. Pansy climbed down off the soft pillows, crawled through the opening at the front of the wagon, and onto the seat next to Papa. "I think it's time you learn to lead the team of horses," proclaimed Papa. "Really?" Pansy said with newfound excitement. Papa handed Pansy the reins and showed her how to hold them. "Not too tight and not too loose," Papa said. "The horses know where to walk, and they'll do most of the work." Pansy felt big as she held the reins, leading two horses, pulling a loaded wagon, two horses in the back, and one smelly dog. "This is fun," Pansy told Papa. For a long time, Papa and Pansy sat quietly while she handled the reins. Occasionally, Papa would speak to instruct her how to maintain the direction and speed of the horses. Papa was right, though. The horses knew what they were doing, and they did most of the work. It was a cool, crisp autumn morning. The sun was shining, but sitting on the bench with Papa made having to say goodbye to Ginny a little easier for Pansy. As they rode along, Pansy thought of a question she wanted to ask Papa. "Papa," Pansy asked, "you and Mama are always telling stories about Aunt Virginia. You don't talk much about her husband, Uncle William. Why is that?" "Well, Pansy," Papa began, "what do you want to know about him?" "What was he like?" Pansy asked. Will Rule, as we often called him, was the most fair and honest man I have ever met. I never knew him to lie or cheat. If he borrowed money, he always paid it back, plus a little more. He was very caring and helped his neighbors when they had needs. He loved to tell people about Jesus and was faithful to church every Sunday. He always called Sunday the Lord's Day, and on that day, he refused to do any work on the farm except feed and water the livestock, because it was only right to take care of them. "Do you remember when we told you about the fire when he and Aunt Virginia lost everything they owned?" asked Papa. "Sure I do," said Pansy. Some of their friends around the community thought the fire was set by a man who did not like Uncle Will. Many urged him to get the sheriff to go talk to the man, but Uncle Will would not accuse him. When people asked him why he would not investigate the fire, Uncle Will would say, "God will take care of us," and he was right. In fact, later on, when that same man was having trouble and needed help, Uncle Will was the first one in line to offer his help. That's the kind of man he was. Pansy thought for a minute and then said, So why don't you tell me more stories about Uncle Will? Most of the stories you told me are about Aunt Virginia." Papa rubbed his chin and looked towards Pansy. There was a sad look in Papa's eyes that she had rarely seen. "Well, Pansy, that's because Uncle Will died and went to be with the Lord while he was still pretty young." "How did he die?" questioned Pansy. "Wow," said Papa. "That's a big story. You remember that Uncle Will and Aunt Virginia had a farm in Kansas?" "Yes," said Pansy. Papa continued. By this time, they had 6 children. You already know about Lucy. Aunt Virginia prayed for her and she got well. Mama told me that story, said Pansy. Okay. They also had 5 other children, Ernest, John, and Wallace. And then there was Billy and Homer. Homer was the youngest. He was only 9 years old when this happened. So what happened? Asked Pansy anxiously. Be patient, said Papa. I'm telling you. Pansy's grip on the reins tightened, and the horses started to slow down. Now, Pansy, Papa said, if I'm going to tell you this story, you're going to need to relax and just guide the team of horses. Sit back, and I'll tell you what had happened. Papa began the story. One day, Uncle Will came in from working in the field. He told Virginia he didn't feel well and was going upstairs to bed. Now, that was very unusual for Will. He was never sick, and even when he did feel bad, he was the kind of man who would say, I'll work even though I'm sick, and that will help me get better. He lay in the bed for the rest of the day, then later came down to the kitchen and told Virginia, I'm afraid something bad is going to happen. What? Virginia asked. Will said, I don't know for sure, but something bad, and you need to trust God to be with you. With that said, he went back to bed for 2 more days. He began to have a temperature and feel very ill. Aunt Virginia tried to help him. She was like a nurse to many people around the community. Growing up alone on the prairie, there were no doctors close by, so she had learned to use home remedies that would help people when they were sick. Papa continued, Virginia had a very caring heart and would go to other people's houses to help them when they were ill. She did all she knew to do for her husband, but he continued to get worse. Finally, she called for the doctor, who rode out to their farmhouse in his buggy, pulled by a beautiful black horse. He came in with his doctor's bag and examined Will. He told Virginia he could not find anything wrong with Will but a little fever. He said Will would be better in a couple days. No, said Uncle Will to the doctor and Virginia. God has told me that I'm going to die. Virginia argued with Will, saying, the doctor knows what he's talking about, and he said you are not dying. The doctor left, and Virginia was alone with Will in the room. Will explained to Virginia that God had told him about his dying. He wanted her to know important things like where money was in certain banks and whom she could depend on and trust. Virginia said to Will, you heard the doctor. You're going to be okay. Listen, Virginia, William spoke sharply. I know that what God has said to me. Virginia insisted, I know you're going to be okay. God has always taken care of us, and he always will. Papa sadly continued. This upset Aunt Virginia very much, of course. She went downstairs and gathered her children in a circle. They all prayed for their dad. The next day, the doctor sent his nurse out to sit with Uncle Will and to see how he was doing. While the nurse stayed in the room with Will, Virginia was downstairs sitting at the kitchen table, thinking about everything her husband had said to her. Just then, she heard the nurse calling down to her from the room upstairs. Virginia, she yelled, come quickly. Virginia rushed up the stairs and burst into the room. She saw Uncle Will lying on the bed, and his face looked very red and hot. The nurse was just laying a wet cloth on his head to cool the temperature. When the cloth touched his head, it was like pouring water onto a hot stove. Steam actually rose from around the wet towel. Virginia rushed to his side, and the nurse checked Uncle Will's pulse and heart. Virginia looked at her husband's face and then looked at the nurse. He's gone, isn't he? Virginia said to the nurse. The nurse shook her head and said, I'm so sorry, Virginia. Yes, he's gone. Papa went quietly on. There was a strange silence that seemed to fill the room. With that silence, there was also a calmness and peace. It was as though the presence of God had come down and filled every corner of that room with the perfect peace that only comes from knowing God the way Will and Virginia knew him. There were no outbursts of crying. There were no feelings of shock or pain. It was as though Virginia had a calm confidence that her husband was in God's hands of mercy and there was no reason to worry. Virginia and the nurse just sat there in silence. A few minutes went by, but not very long, when all of a sudden the silence was broken by the sound of a cough coming from your Uncle Will. Then another cough, and his eyes opened. The first words out of his mouth were, "Virginia, I was there. I died and I went to heaven." Papa continued. Aunt Virginia was so shocked. She had hardly heard his words at first. "Will," Virginia said, "you are alive." For the next few hours, Will told Virginia and his whole family who were gathered there what he had experienced in that short time he was dead. "Virginia," he said, "death is nothing. People are always afraid of dying, but I want you to know it is nothing. There is no reason to fear death." Papa eagerly continued the story. As his family gathered near to him, he told them what heaven is like and what he had seen. He said, "There are no words to describe how wonderful it is. There is no need of anything or lack of anything. Everything is perfect. I saw people who I had not seen in years since they had passed away. I can't even begin to tell you of the beauty of the colors everywhere. The most beautiful scene on earth is nothing compared to what it is like there." Then Will said something I'll always remember, said Papa. He told Virginia, "Time is nothing there. If you live to become an old woman before you die, it will seem like only 5 minutes have passed, and then you'll be there with me." Papa continued. The rest of that day and into the night, Uncle Will called his family one at a time to his side and told them not to worry about him because he was going to heaven, and they would all join him later after they had lived their whole lives. He reminded them that God is always faithful and would take care of them, even if he were not with them. After he had told everyone how wonderful, beautiful, and perfect heaven is, and after he told each child how much he loved them and instructed them to take good care of their mother, he then told everyone he was tired and wanted to sleep. He closed his eyes and drifted off into the most calm and peaceful rest. Later on that night, when the nurse checked on him, she saw he was not breathing. Again, she checked his pulse and his heart. This time, he had peacefully gone away to heaven to stay. Pansy sat for a while thinking about the story she had just been told. Papa could see she was trying to think of a question for him, so he just let her think for a while. Papa took the reins of the horses and led them down the road. After a long silence, Pansy broke the quiet, saying, "Papa, why would God bring Uncle Will back to life only to take him away again? That seems, well..." Papa finished her sentence. "Mean?" "Well, yes," said Pansy. "Why would God do that?" Papa began, "We can't always know why God allows certain things. The next few years were very difficult on their farm." "How come?" asked Pansy. "Well," Papa said, "there was a horrible drought followed by a few years where there was no money, jobs, or food. It was a time we call the Depression. It was a very bad time in America." Pansy thought, "So that's even worse," she asked. "Why did God take Uncle Will away from Virginia and all his children right when they needed him the most?" Papa sighed a little and started again. "Like I said, we don't always know why God allows the things he does, but this is what I do understand. No matter how hard times were, Virginia and every one of Will's children never forgot what he had told them. I think his coming back from the dead gave them strength to trust God and to never doubt his love, no matter how difficult life seemed to be for them. There were times when they had to trust God for their next meal, but they never went hungry. They always had enough for themselves and a little extra to share with others. During this time, many others were starving and losing everything they owned. What Uncle Will told his family allowed them to see life in a bigger way." "What do you mean?" queried Pansy. "From then on, they all knew that this world was From then on, they all knew this world was more than the everyday work and struggle of living. They knew they were headed to a bigger and better place. They were eventually going to an eternal place with God. So, when the bad times came along, they always knew there was more to life than the tough times they were experiencing now. They knew there was a great reward waiting at the end for those who believed and trusted God. "Tell me more about that, Papa," said Pansy. "Not now, daughter," said Papa. "Maybe we'll save that for when we get to Galveston Island." "When will that be?" asked Pansy. "Not long," Papa replied. "Not long." The end.